This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Go to our website at wdtatpodcast.com and click on support to learn how you can be part of this effort to learn how to have better conversations, increase compassion, and build bridges, not walls. You can make a one-time donation or become a patron for as little as $1 a month and receive patron-only benefits. This week's shout-out to our patrons goes to Camille Cody. Thanks for being a patron, Camille, and thanks for supporting the podcast. Now let's get to the interview. In this episode, I talk with Paul Kirst about his work with Better Angels to teach and promote dialogue across the red and blue divide. We also discuss civil wars, both past and future, and what they might teach us. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about things we're not supposed to, learn how to have difficult conversations, and talk to people about what makes them different. This is the We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land podcast, where we do talk about that with me, Lucas Land.
It's never the right place or time. It's imperceptible to the eye. It's never the right place or time.
My guest today is Paul Kirst. Welcome to the podcast, Paul.
It's great to be here.
You and I connected online, and it turns out we have a lot more connections than we kind of realized. And so we've been chatting pre-recording a little bit about both of our time in Bolivia and Bolivian politics. And you worked with MCC, and we know some of the same people. So small world. Mennonites are always kind of a small world, and I'm really excited to talk to you today.
It was kind of a really interesting surprise to find out how deep the connections were.
Well, the reason we connected, part of the reason we connected is because I've been wanting to talk about spiral dynamics, and we may touch on spiral dynamics, but I was really interested to find out that you have worked with an organization called Better Angels Workshops, which I had never heard of before, and they do work across the aisle trying to get red and blue people to talk to each other. So I'm excited to hear more about that. But first, tell me a little bit about yourself. You know, you don't have to go from birth until now, but just a little bit about who you are and where you live and what you do.
Okay, well, my wife and I live in Minnesota, and part-time in Minnesota, part-time in Wisconsin. And I'm a retired financial executive. I work both in the nonprofit and for-profit sector. And I've been interested in peace and social justice for quite a while. It probably wasn't ultimately an accident that I ended up working deeply with the Mennonites. And it's pretty hard to spend any time with MCC in particular and not end up with a very deep commitment to peace and social justice issues. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have 2 twin daughters, and they're both grown in their professions. And again, kind of my avocation right now is being a moderator, a co-moderator for Better Angels in their various workshops. I'm kind of new to it, taken quite a lot of training, and got a workshop coming up in February up in Duluth, Minnesota. So that's kind of what my background is.
So when you said you're part-time in Minnesota and part-time in Wisconsin, most people think of, snowbirds that travel to Florida or somewhere sunny. So you're kind of a snowbird that just stays in the snow? Is that how that works?
That's kind of it. It's okay. We have my wife and I both lived in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota.
Okay. Uh-huh.
For our whole marriage, and we have a little cottage up in rural Wisconsin, about 2 hours northeast of the Twin Cities. She's a real Northwoods girl, and that's
Okay.
kind of why
Mm-hmm.
we don't. It's interesting. We live in a place that's basically it's like a almost like a rural in the woods community, and
Mm.
a lot of the residents up here actually pack up and go to various locations in the south during the winter. So
Mm-hmm.
it's very
Yeah.
very quiet up here right now.
Yeah. I actually worked at a Christian camp in northern Wisconsin in the Chequamegon National Forest.
Oh, okay.
It's and it's a beautiful, beautiful area. So I can understand why you would spend time up there because it is
Yeah.
a beautiful
Yeah, we're
part of the
essentially
country.
right in the middle of a big forest, and
Fantastic. Well, before we get too deep into Better Angels, I wonder, can you tell me, like, I asked this of a lot of guests, and I think it's an interesting question. What did you learn about conflict growing up? Like, what were some of the messages you got, maybe that you had to unlearn, or things that you heard or saw as you were growing up about conflict?
well, that was a very interesting question. It's probably the one I had to put the most thought into. Um, Actually, nothing really dramatic. I mean, there was certainly domestic conflict in my family of origin,
Mm-hmm.
uh, mostly between my mother and father, but it was not of a particularly destructive nature. So I didn't get any real bad messages centered around the issue of conflict. Now, having said that, I don't particularly go seek out conflict myself, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
not overly conflict avoidant either. Probably most of the experience I've had with, and I'll call it dramatic conflict, came later on in life. I spent a few years in the inner city in Omaha, Nebraska, um,
Mm-hmm.
living with, my roommates were African American,
Mm-hmm.
and and I worked for a predominantly African American agency in the inner city.
Mm-hmm.
And then after, interestingly enough, after my 30-month term in Bolivia was cut short because I transferred up to Honduras to work the Civil War in Nicaragua when it was going on, doing
Mm.
refugee relief work. And
Wow. Yeah.
I got a very good dosage of what not just conflict, but what violence is all about in
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
particular experience.
Mm-hmm.
It does give me a perspective on the conflict that's going on. It's very persistent in the midst of our society right now, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of people, when I ask that question, tend to focus on the personal, which you did as well, and it's interesting to think about kind of what we got growing up and what we learned. But it's also the part that we maybe leave out or that people don't always necessarily experience is social and political conflict. And I
Exactly.
think in the United States, we've kind of been through so many years since the Civil War, really, where, of course, there's conflicts that are political and we have arguments and discussions, but not the kind of political instability, violence, coup d'etats, things that you may have seen and experienced during that civil war in Nicaragua, and that we're currently kind of going through a little bit here in Bolivia. It's not too intense right now, but certainly during the shutdown, October to November of 2019, I felt that feeling of like, what is going to happen? So for you, when you were going through, that's a very interesting, I think, experience that a lot of people don't have. So for you, as a North American, going through that and working in Honduras with refugees and experiencing that political and social conflict, what was that like for you, learning about conflict maybe in a different way and on a completely different level?
Well, I mean, obviously, it was an incredibly deep experience. I've always taken an approach to life of you got to be very open to what's going on around you, and you got to be very cognizant of what's going on around you, and as much as possible, do it without judgment, simply so you can be very clear about what you're observing and what you're hearing and what you're living.
Mm-hmm.
One of the, and it was, I mean, as I'd said earlier, before the podcast started, I was down in Bolivia as a volunteer when the last big bloody coup took place, when Hugo Banzer was thrown out. And it wasn't a big, terribly bloody coup, but it was fairly violent, and some people died.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, being immersed in the Civil War in Nicaragua, because although I was based out of Tegucigalpa, Honduras, I had to travel in and out of Managua and other rural parts of Nicaragua so I knew what the heck was going on, and ultimately had to report all that back to Akron.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I suppose one of the most interesting things as to how that affects me now, in light of how our current political situation and social situation is unfolding. I don't know how closely you follow what's going on here in the United States right now, but you're starting, particularly with the impeachment starting, you're beginning to get some rumblings with some of the supporters of President Trump saying, "Well, if you impeach him, you're going to start a civil war." So there's kind of a little saber rattling going on, shall we say?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'm left with a kind of a sense of, I say to myself, dude, you better be very careful about what you ask for, because you have no idea if you start this, what you're going to get. Because most North Americans just don't experience massive violence and institutional violence, and like Latin America has experienced on and off for a long time.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say it scares me, but it certainly is of concern.
Yeah, it was a little strange to me living through the shutdown, the protests after the election that happened here in Bolivia, and kind of being stuck at home. We were in a very safe place and felt fine, but also couldn't really do much because everything was shut down.
Right.
And we could hear protests, and we were following the news and everything like that. And then when Evo finally stepped down and left and went to Mexico, and it was announced that the shutdown would end at midnight on a Tuesday night, then the next day on Wednesday, it was like everything went back to normal. Because people in Latin America have been through this so many times, to them it's very normal, in a lot of ways. It's like, okay, we did this thing was happening, and then when things return to normal, it's almost just like, hey, we got to make a living, we got to make some money, and we got to eat, so okay, let's get back to work, and everything just kind of, it was very strange to me that things returned so quickly to normal, because it is the experience of everyone here, and that's so different from the experience of most North Americans.
Well, yeah, and especially there in Bolivia. I remember, I think the number was when Banzer was thrown out, and again, he was not killed because he later actually won an election.
Yeah.
But when he was thrown out by Padilla, I think his name was, it was, again, this is back in the late 70s. So this is a long time ago. This is 40 years ago. That had been the 180th coup that had taken place in Bolivia.
That's just unreal. It's just so hard to even imagine for U.S. citizens who've lived through how many elections and how many changes of power.
Right.
A lot of people call each election a bloodless coup, right? Like each time that we have this change of power in the U.S., it's in the history of the world, it's kind of a weird thing, right? It doesn't happen as often as we think it does. There's a podcast that I want to mention because it speaks to what you're talking about in the U.S. right now in the situation, the political situation. And, it touches on the theme of the podcast in things that we don't like to talk about or things that are difficult to talk about.
Yes.
It's a podcast called It Could Happen Here. And it's by a journalist. I don't remember his name, but it's a journalist who has a lot of experience in countries and covering changes in power and civil wars in other countries. And he goes through in this series all of the different possibilities for and why he says we could potentially. It doesn't mean that we will, but he's kind of giving the possibilities and why we should consider that it could happen again in the U.S., that we have a civil war. What are the things that make it, likely? And he covers everything from like groups on the right and groups on the left that both are pretty kind of charged up in the current environment, and how each side could maybe instigate or participate or play a role in some kind of conflict and civil war in the U.S. And I think it is important for us to remember that democracy and the agreements we kind of have are more tenuous than we tend to think. And they can fall apart when people stop agreeing that we should behave or act in a certain way or follow whatever the rules are that we've agreed on before. And I appreciate you kind of bringing that up, because it is something we need to consider that we don't in the U.S., we don't in North America, because we think, well, it's been this way for generations. We've been able to sort of have 200 plus years of relative peace within our own country. And so, yeah, it's just going to keep going that way, and that's not guaranteed,
Well, and I would be interesting to listen to that, and I would agree with it. I don't in any way feel that it's inevitable.
Right.
But
right.
what's different now, and maybe I'm going to kind of inadvertently jump to your last question about addressing the two-party. How does it address the two-party thing?
Mm-hmm.
The thing to me that's changed about U.S. politics and the society as a whole, it's not just politics, but in a democracy that is representative and is based on the rule of law, and inherent in that is the whole issue of it's not like everybody agrees and there's no differences. There's always vast differences.
Right.
But you kind of take the approach of, we're gonna be civil. We're gonna talk to each other. We're gonna hammer out. We're gonna be very passionate about what we believe in and what we advocate for. But we're gonna hammer out some compromise, and that's been the basis. Even other than that brief period. Well, I guess it wasn't so brief, but during the Civil War, when
right.
Actual civil violence broke out, we've mostly enjoyed this environment of compromise, of discussion, of working out your passions in a respectable and honorable way. And that's and I've been active in politics since I was in college, and that's the biggest thing that I've noticed is that's what's gone now. And I keep using the term. I'm sure my friends get tired of me saying it. Politics has become war in the United States. That's the whole approach.
Yeah.
It's if you're a red, you don't view a blue as a political opponent who you will wrestle with and you will contend with, but ultimately do it in a civil way. And both sides are guilty of this. They now view the opposition as an enemy.
Right.
And so there's no listening. There's no attempt to understand. There's no attempt to meaningfully discuss, and compromise is a dirty word. And that's, if the country continues along that path, that's what would bring us to civil war, because ultimately you're talking about a win-lose negotiating situation, and ultimately one side is going to feel that it needs to win,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
you keep pushing the outer edges of it, and human history gives you perfect examples of where that ultimately leads. It leads to violence. It leads to
Right.
wars. Again, I don't think it's inevitable here, and I'm actually quite optimistic that it won't be. But never in my life have I ever thought that it would ever happen. But I can see that
Mm.
it's possible now.
Well, it's a good segue to talk about this work that you're doing and moderating with the Better Angels organization. How did you end up getting connected with them? And then tell us a little bit about who they are and what they do.
Well, it was kind of, I was told about them by a friend who had just heard about them. She'd actually seen a video on, I think it was PBS.
Hmm.
And so I contacted them, and it's very active, and it has a lot of its origins in Minnesota. So Minnesota is probably one of the
Okay.
most active places in the country where it's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, what they do, and I kind of do explain it by giving you a brief summary of what their mission is, and they said
Mm-hmm.
essentially it's kind of trying to understand the other side's point of view. They really strive to do that. They strive to
Mm-hmm.
get people to engage with dialogue, engage with those we disagree with,
Mm-hmm.
and rather than disagreeing, look for common ground. And then really working to support the principles and develop the principles that bring us together rather than divide us. So it's really aimed, if I had to summarize it in terms of, they're really trying to re-teach civil engagement 101,
Mm-hmm.
because we've lost
Mm-hmm.
that. We just don't even know how to a large extent. And it's not just the politicians, it's the citizens. It's like they don't really know how to engage with somebody who believes differently than they do.
Right. Right.
And so, and again, the Better Angels just developed a series of workshops that basically teach really, really simple techniques. I mean, there's no rocket science at all
Mm-hmm.
about how to engage with somebody that you disagree with in a basically respectful way, really aimed at, and again, they'll say this, that the real ultimate goal of every workshop is not to get people to change their mind, but
Mm-hmm.
teach people how to first of all listen, and if possible understand where the other side's coming from. Those are the two goals. And if you can then also learn how to engage with them in a respectful, civil way, that's kind of like icing on the cake.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole principle is just getting us back in society to where we know we know how to do this, because we don't know
Mm-hmm.
how to do it any longer. We certainly have. We're not demonstrating that we have that ability as a society.
Right. Right. So have you, in your experience with them, have you noticed that there is like an interest, and sometimes I think we feel, or it seems like there's not an interest in this kind of dialogue or this kind of work, because the conversations we see online or in the media are so polarized, we can kind of believe that people aren't really interested. But in your experience, do you find you must be able to get enough people together to have these conversations or be interested in this? Do you see that there is interest in learning these skills and having these kinds of conversations?
Oh yeah, I mean, it certainly is demonstrated, you see it you particularly see it in some of the less intense, less structured workshops that they do,
Hmm.
because you draw from all kinds of different people,
Right.
And because it's not quite as, they have what they call the red blue workshops, which are highly structured.
Mm-hmm.
They're set up to be equally divided between reds and blues. And the other ones are less structured, and they don't necessarily have to be as evenly divided. But you get people to express themselves a little bit more in the less structured environments. But yeah, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of this. In fact, I don't know if you've encountered. You can get this book online. When you're done, look up Google the word hidden tribes.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically a study that was done a number of years ago, pretty extensive national study where they, in effect, sliced and diced the political spectrum rather than looking at it in a bipolar way of liberal versus conservative or red versus blue. They actually sliced
Mm-hmm.
and diced it up into 7 different segments running from
Oh,
between the
yeah.
two extremes. And what they were looking for was, they identified what they call the wings of the two extremes of the political spectrums,
Mm-hmm.
because they were viewed as ones who were the most strident, the most ardent, and most passionate, um, and in many ways the most closed about the whole thing. And it's not that they eliminated them; they just identified what percentage of the population made up those segments. Well, cut to the chase, there were between those extremes, um, there were a number of groups that were, they were along, they fit somewhere along the conservative versus liberal spectrum, but the thing that really set them apart from the wings or the extremes is that they were deeply interested in compromise. They didn't like
Mm.
the system as it was run. Well,
Mm-hmm.
guess what percentage of the population made up those? And they were called, that's what the title came from, the hidden tribes.
Uh-huh.
They made up 2/3 of the country.
Wow.
In other words, only 1/3 of the population really fit into to those ardent, dyed in the wool, we want to engage in political warfare.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's a lot of, from what I've seen, the little that I've seen through my involvement with Better Angels, but from, statistics like what I just said here,
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a I think there's a real yearning in this country for this kind of dialogue. Most people don't want politics as we currently practice it.
Yeah. Yeah, that is, I'm super fascinated and interested in reading up more on this study, because I think if we base kind of our perception of that political landscape mainly on the media and our interactions on Facebook maybe or things like that, I would have guessed that the statistic was very different, right? Like that,
Of course.
that the interest in dialogue is very low, and that our polarization is so high that people aren't even interested in dialogue. But what you're saying is, no, there's actually high interest. More than half, 2/3 of the population is interested in some form of compromise and dialogue and talking through the issues and coming to solutions together, not this dig your heels in kind of politics that we see being played out on the media stage and on the sort of national political stage.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So, well, to get maybe down to the nitty gritty a little bit. So, what are some things, as you've worked with Better Angels and been through some of these conversations and workshops, what are the things that are really helpful that maybe we can share with people that you've seen kind of help people be able to have these dialogues?
Well, I suppose I'll cut to what the things that I learned right away with first of all, the trainings that I took just going to
Mm-hmm.
some of the workshops, and then deepening it more as I trained to be a moderator. Um, and I suppose the biggest thing was a couple things, and it's very beneficial, and it would be beneficial for people to just really try to engage with somebody who thinks differently than they do. It doesn't have to be over political issues. I mean, there's other issues you can do it,
Mm-hmm.
and to do it in a way, again, that is civil and respectful. But the two things to really strive for proactively is, if you're going to do it, strive to listen and listen deeply, and strive to understand what they're saying, understand their perspective. Don't come at this from the standpoint of, I'm going to engage with this person of the opposite political spectrum that I am, and what it's going to be all about is me hammering them with my beliefs and my
Mm-hmm.
convictions, and telling them how bad they are because they don't believe what I believe. Because that's
Mm-hmm.
so much of what's going on now.
Right.
But just,
Yeah.
engage, but do it respectfully, and do it with no intention of trying to change their mind, or to, preach to them about what you believe, but kind of in a humble way, strive to listen to them, strive to understand where they're coming from, and if you're lucky, you might be able to engage with them and share
Mm-hmm.
and share with them where you're coming from. That's kind of the core of what I've learned.
And that's so hard. It seems very simple just to say it, right? And then you and I both know in practice, when we're in conversations with people, it can be really difficult. If someone says something that kind of, for lack of a better word, triggers or maybe makes us feel like, oh man, I can't let somebody just say something, right? I can't just let them say something I disagree with. I need to counter it, right? We have that kind of reaction. But to really stick to this idea of listening deeply and trying to understand what people are saying. I think when I'm at my best, I'll ask people questions about what they're saying and what they really believe, that maybe I don't, if I'm being generous in my listening and like trying to really understand somebody, things won't make sense to me, right? Like just on a basic level, like trying to understand, well, you believe that, but I don't understand why you believe that, or how do you believe that, or what is it that brought you to that conclusion maybe, or lots of different questions I might have if I'm focused on understanding and listening first.
Right.
And then I'm not engaged in like, well, I'm just going to counter all the points, right? I'm just going to take what you said and then tear it all apart and show how you're wrong. But I think that's scary to a lot of people, because we think if we lose, or if we don't engage in a certain way, that our side somehow is going to lose. Yeah.
Which is from a psychological standpoint, that's a very disempowered, fearful place to be.
Right.
That your convictions and your beliefs are so weak that opposition to it, that your approach to opposition is to be afraid of it and try to attack it. I mean, it's like, what's wrong with live and let live? It's like, you believe, you say potato, I say potato. Well, just because you say potato doesn't mean that my potato is being attacked, or that I need to feel attacked, or that I need to defend the way I say potato. I mean, that's a silly example, but
yeah.
But I mean, it's really. And again, I guess the biggest thing that I came away with was just learn to listen, strive to understand, and asking questions is a very good way to do that, because not only particularly and again there's communication techniques of how to do it in the best way, but I mean, when somebody shares something with you that they know is opposite of what you believe, and then you actually ask them about it and express to them that, okay, let me be sure I understand exactly what you said.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's a very powerful place to be.
Yeah.
And quite truthfully, and I don't say it for offensive reasons, but it in a sense is very disarming to them.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
you take away the need for them to counterattack you. If you're basically
Mm-hmm.
saying, and again, you don't, just because you understand where they're coming from and maybe understand it deeply and maybe even somewhat sympathize with that belief, doesn't mean that you believe any less ardently what you believe. It
Right.
doesn't mean you have to
Right.
concede and say, "Oh yeah, you're right."
Yeah, and what this is making me think that when we engage in conversations, a lot of times we fall very easily into certain roles, right, that are sort of set out for us by by those different sides, right?
Exactly.
So whether it's the red side or blue side or whatever side it is, it's easy to fall into the role of, well, here's the talking points I know how to respond to this accusation, right?
Right.
And more, it feels like so many conversations are only talking points. And I think, and maybe this is also what you've noticed in people wanting to engage in this kind of dialogue, is people are tired of talking points, I think. Like it's very obvious when you're in a conversation when someone's just sort of parroting and not actually engaged or interested in an honest sort of dialogue. But we can also fall prey to that. It's easy to fall into, well, I'm just going to kind of play this role. I'm on this side, so here's the role that I play, and here's my side, so here's kind of the talking points that I have. And so what you're talking about, I love the idea of finding a way. Asking questions is a good way, but there may be different things that kind of help people, kind of take people aback a little bit, kind of surprise people.
Right.
We talked about you and I both having experience with Mennonites, and so I can bring Jesus up maybe a little bit, but Jesus like surprises people all the time by saying things that were unexpected. And I think
Exactly.
I think that trick in conversations and dialogue helps us get out of those roles, right? It helps jar us a little bit and go, oh yeah, that's right. I'm talking to a person.
Right, and it resets the field of play totally. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, that all of the dialogue and the conversation has really settled into some very old and boring patterns, and that's why I think people are getting tired of it. I mean, there's only so many issues that are rustled over, and quite frankly, neither side has been terribly creative about coming up with new arguments for their side or arguments against the other side.
Right.
So they just keep going. It's like the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. I mean, how many times can you hear about fake news before you just totally, come up with a different way of describing these people you don't like.
Yeah.
Don't use, and I mean, the difficulty, it does require that you, if you're going to do it and really engage in it, you first of all, you got to wrestle with what it is that you really do believe and why do you believe it. And then take it beyond, how do I describe, how do I respond, or how do I tell people this is what I believe? Don't use the same set of bullet points. If you're come from the liberal side, egalitarianism is a very important thing to you, but find a way to describe it other than in a 5-word bullet point that everybody else describes in the same way, because the truth is the other side has already factored that out, just as you factored their bullet points out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think stories are super helpful in understanding, like explaining maybe why you value something instead of something else, or just because that's what you value, like a story that helps understand like how you came to that, maybe. And
Right.
You said this thing about these narratives or these talking points kind of being boring, and that both sides, the Reds and the Blues, have not really come up with many new stories or new talking points. It's very recycled. Like there's different ways of looking at it, I guess, a little bit, or maybe they try to put a new spin. And I just, when you said that, it made me think, yeah, because for both sides, it has worked for them to keep them in some form of power, right? I mean, we've changed presidents and we've elected different senators, but all in all, those two parties have sort of been able to stay as our main two options, and it has benefited them to be able to say, well, like, these are your two choices, and we're going to keep giving you kind of these two narratives, and we don't have to change it at all because right now it's kind of working for us. It's keeping us with our side sort of backing us and seeing us as the only option, right?
Well, and quite frankly, it's a very powerful political tactic.
Yeah.
I mean, the truth of the matter is, if you're, and this is really very much for, when you get to this place of politics is war, and it's, that both sides are getting, the Republicans started it first, and they're maybe a little bit ahead, but the Democrats are catching up real fast.
Yeah.
But the benefit of it from a pure, retaining power political respect is that, if you can reduce the politics and getting people to vote for you to saying, I'm a Republican, you're a Republican, you vote for me because you hate the Democrats. That's kind of where it's at. You don't vote for me because I'm going to do this for you and that for you and whatever. Well, that totally takes all the onus off you as a politician. You don't have to deliver on anything.
Right.
You don't have to promise.
And you don't have to have. You don't have to have a vision. You don't have to have a vision for what this better world that you want to help build looks like. Right.
Exactly. If your constituent is made up of a bunch of working class, blue collar, unemployed people, you don't have. If you can get them to vote for you because they hate the other side, and you've painted the opposition in such bad light that they will vote against them by voting for you, you don't have to do anything you don't have to promise them anything about how you're going to improve their life or what you're going to do to maybe help them get a job or get them better health care. You don't have to do any of that.
Yeah.
And you can reduce the politics to negative politics.
Well, this kind of brings me to that last question that you mentioned before. The way that I see Better Angels sort of frames it is getting red and blues to talk to each other. But I can imagine that kind of work actually, as you and I are talking already, I'm seeing this happen through the conversation, is that it breaks down that two-party system, right? Has that been kind of your experience when you get people in a room to talk to each other and have dialogue across, like better dialogue where they're actually listening and trying to understand each other, that it kind of begins to break down this idea that, well, there's just two sides, and maybe what are some of your experiences seeing that happen?
I don't know if I would say it breaks down the two-party system. But what I would say is that it opens up in their minds that there's a different way to do politics than how we're doing it. So it doesn't necessarily automatically lead to we're not going to have a two-party system any longer. But it definitely, at the very least, creates a lot of discontent with the system as it exists amongst those who participate in it.
Well, what are some of the any other skills that are taught kind of through those workshops? You mentioned listening deeply and trying to understand what other people are saying. Are there any maybe tips or tricks that you can also share with us from those workshops?
Let me think about that for a second.
Sure.
Probably the only other trick, if you will, or tip, is that particularly when you venture into, going beyond the listening, beyond the understanding, and you actually get into sharing with them your perspective, lace it with as much personal experience as possible. If you're gonna, trying to think of an example. Well, okay, here I'll paint a little scenario for you. You come back to North America after having spent, a substantial amount of time and energy living in Latin America, and you encounter somebody who's anti-immigrant, anti-Hispanic. Share with them, okay, I don't hold those beliefs, and this is why I don't, and use your personal experience. I remember a conversation I had with a gentleman in the church that my wife and I attend sometime, and he was kind of starting to rag on immigrants and how lazy they are and terrible they are. And the way I responded, and again, I at the time was working for the Minnesota Literacy Council, which a lot of our students are immigrants. And I was assisting in English as a second language class. And I basically just said, well, Tom, I don't really it hasn't been my experience, and, that I've interact with immigrants quite often, that I haven't found any of them to be like what you just described. They're hardworking. They're some of the best entrepreneurs we have here in the Twin Cities, and they're not lazy and they're not stupid. But it was, I didn't just say, well, Tom, you're wrong. They're not lazy and stupid. I tied it to this is my experience. I interact with immigrants on a regular basis.
Right.
So I guess that's, tie as much of your own personal experience into it as possible.
Well, Paul, this has been a great conversation, and not knowing you prior to our conversation, I am pleasantly surprised, and it's been fantastic hearing your perspectives and connecting over our experience living in Latin America as well. So I really appreciate it. I want to wrap up with just a couple things. We've shared a lot of ideas and a lot of good resources, but want to kind of leave people with something that they can do, an action step maybe that we would each recommend, and then a resource, a recommendation. Could be a book or a movie or any number of things, another podcast that we want to share with people that they can continue to dive deeper into kind of this area that we've been talking about. And I'll start, so I can give you a little bit of time to think about your two things. The idea that you kind of ended with is really one that I think I want to leave people with as something you can do that's really practical in conversations, because so often I see when we get into conversations on Facebook or other, even in real life, that we're drawn into, like we said before, taking on those roles and choosing sides and then starting to parrot those talking points. And I think one thing that does is make the conversation very abstract, and it makes it into the conversation is primarily about ideas and maybe power in some way. And when you said, using your personal experience when you're talking about ideas, I have had that experience and seen other people when they bring it to, okay, I'm not arguing with you about a theory, but I want to share with you this story or this experience and say, this is what my experience has been, and this is why kind of I think this, because I knew this person, or I worked and lived in Latin America, like you said, and I could understand why, I've said this before, if Bolivia bordered the United States, I could understand why a lot of Bolivians would be migrating to the United States. Many do, but not as many as from Central America, right? Because it's a very long, it's very expensive and a long flight to Miami to try and move to the U.S., right?
Exactly.
So this idea of using our personal experiences and bringing it to stories and things that can connect a little bit more personally, rather than the talking points or the abstract ideas. I think that's so important. And when we maybe feel ourselves getting sucked in to the kind of talking points conversations, maybe it's time to pause and think, well, what can I connect with that matters to me personally? What really gets at the heart of why this is important to me, and I want to express, and what's a story that can kind of connect with that. I love that idea, so I'm really thankful for you sharing that. And I'll again recommend this podcast. It's called It Could Happen Here, and I'll put the link to it in show notes. It's very well done, and it's not sensational, or as you said, it's not saying that this is that a second American Civil War is inevitable, and here's all the reasons why. It's much more nuanced, but it's very thoughtful and very thorough, and I think it helps U.S. citizens and North Americans to think more carefully about our politics and the realities of what it can lead to, and maybe it will give us pause on either side to stop and think about the real ramifications of our politics for the lives of people and for how it affects a society, I guess.
Right.
It's an excellent podcast. So I want to recommend that. Paul, what are your two things that you want to leave us with? An action step that people can do, and something you want to recommend as well to people. Maybe a book that's been influential for you.
Well, I guess from an action step standpoint, maybe it would be two things. One, I'll give a shout out for Better Angels.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would encourage people to, go online and look up better-angels.org to learn more about it. And if there's some interest, attend a workshop, try to get involved in some way. And then, more generally, venture out and try to engage with somebody who's maybe a little bit different, thinks a little differently than you do on some of these major political issues, and try to do it in as civil and respectful way as possible. In terms of resources, and I guess I will, again, obviously there's stuff on the Better Angels website, but two books that I read kind of up front as I started to get more involved with Better Angels that helped me get in better contact with the reality of what was going on politically. One was oh gosh, I can't even remember, this book by Jonathan Haidt, The Righteous Mind.
Yes, I've heard of this book. Yeah.
Why? And then the other one is a book called The Republican Brain by Chris Mooney. They're very good. They really delve into, the psychological and values reasons of why people are different, and what are the real basis, both in terms of value and personality, of the left and the right. They were very, very informative.
Yeah,
then,
those are great.
yeah. I guess I would encourage anybody to look up go online and look up Hidden Tribes. You can download the book. It's a freebie.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite enlightening.
Yeah. Yeah, I will include all of those in the show notes so that people can find them easily and track down those for further kind of reading and learning. Because we all have a lot more to learn, and I really appreciate you coming and sharing with us about your experience and what you've been learning with your work with Better Angels, but also just through your experience working in Latin America and other places. So it's been a real pleasure, Paul, and I'm really thankful for you giving your time to talk to me today.
Well, it's been an honor to be asked to participate in this, and say hello to Phil the next time you see him, and que le vaya bien.
Thanks for joining us today on We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land. If you like what you hear, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Help us spread the word by sharing it on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the handle @WDTAT Podcast. You can also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can support the podcast by visiting our website at wdtatpodcast.com and clicking on support. You can make a one-time donation or consider becoming a monthly supporter through Patreon. You'll receive bonus content and access to patron-only benefits. Thanks for your support. We would love to hear from you. Leave us a voicemail by going to our website and clicking Send Voicemail. Your voicemail could be featured in a future episode. You can also email us at wdtatpodcast@gmail.com. Many thanks to Neil Curran and Infielder for the use of their music. You can find more of their music online at infielder.bandcamp.com. A final thought from Brené Brown. The willingness to show up changes us. It makes us a little braver each time. Until next time, keep showing up and keep being brave.
What are you gonna do?
Que le vaya bien.